The heat in the west could kill you, but it wasn't the cruelest thing under the sun. In the town of Redemption Gulch, a place that had long forgotten its name's meaning, they found new ways to measure a person's worth. For Amelia Rose Thornton, that value was tallied in gold coins and whiskey chits. They placed a price tag on a human soul right there on the splintered porch of the town's only saloon. Her crime, falling in love with the wrong man and carrying his child. As the bidding began, a shadow fell across the dust-choked street. A stranger had come to town, and he intended to make a purchase not with gold, but with a currency the town understood far better blood, the dust of redemption. Gulch was a fine red powder that coated everything, a permanent blush of shame on a town that had none. It settled on the sweat-slick brows of leering men on the warped planks of the Salty Dog Saloon, and on the pale, tear-streaked face of Amelia Rose Thornton. She stood on a makeshift auction block, 3 whiskey crates, hastily stacked, her hands bound in front of her swelling belly. The calico dress she wore, once a symbol of hopeful domesticity, was now a tattered flag of her surrender. Her story was a common brand of tragedy, the kind whispered about by women over laundry buckets and sneered at by men spitting tobacco juice. She had arrived 2 months prior, the intended bride of Beaufort Beau Sinclair, the handsome, silver-tongued son of the formidable cattle baron Alistair Sinclair. Beau had promised her a life of comfort, a sprawling home under the vast Montana sky, a world away from the crowded, anonymous life she'd known back east. He had courted her with poetry and sweet assurances, and in a moment of trusting love, she had given him everything. The discovery of her pregnancy should have been a joy. Instead, it had been a verdict. Beau's letters, once filled with soaring prose, became short, then sporadic, then stopped altogether. When she'd used the last of her savings to follow him west to Redemption Gulch, the nearest town to the Sinclair ranch, she found him not with a ring, but with an excuse. His father, he'd claimed, would never approve. The Sinclair name could not be sullied by a premature heir and a hurried wedding. He'd left her in a boarding house with a handful of dollars and a final hollow promise to make things right. Things were made right, but not for Amelia. Her money ran out. The boarding house owner, a woman with a heart as hard as packed earth, had turned her out. It was then that Bartholomew Barty Finch, the proprietor of the Salty Dog Saloon and the town's unofficial ruler, had taken an interest. Finch was a man whose girth was matched only by his greed. He saw Amelia not as a person, but as an asset, a debt to be collected. Beau Sinclair, it turned out, had not only a taste for sweet-talking Eastern girls, but also for sour mash whiskey and losing hands of poker. He owed Finch a significant sum. A debt of honor must be paid. Finch had declared his voice slick with false piety as his men dragged her from the alley she'd been sleeping in. And since the young Mr. Sinclair has seen fit to vanish, his property will have to suffice. So here she stood. Property. The auctioneer was Finch himself, his belly straining the buttons of a sweat-stained vest. He held a gavel in one meaty fist, banging it against the saloon's support post to draw a crowd. "Gentlemen, gentlemen," he boomed, a grin splitting his fleshy face. "A unique opportunity presents itself today in Redemption Gulch, a piece of premium stock, you might say, formerly of the Sinclair stable, but now available to the highest bidder." A wave of cruel laughter rippled through the assembled crowd of dusty cowboys, desperate prospectors, and hard-eyed drifters. They appraised her like livestock, their gazes lingering on her face, her bound hands, the unmistakable curve of her belly. Humiliation burned hotter than the midday sun. Each stare was a physical blow, each snicker a fresh cut to her soul. She refused to cry. She'd shed all her tears for Beau. These men would not get that from her. She lifted her chin, her blue eyes scanning the jeering faces with a defiance she did not feel. "What are we buyin', Barty?" a grimy miner called out. "A wife, a laundress, all that and more." Finch roared. "She's gently bred, can read and write, I'm told. And for those of you looking to build a legacy," he gestured theatrically toward her stomach, "she comes with a bonus. A 2-for-1 deal." The crowd erupted. The vulgarity of it sent a fresh wave of nausea through Amelia. She closed her eyes, praying for the earth to swallow her whole. This was the end of her world. She would be sold to some brute, her child born into a life of servitude and misery, all because she had dared to believe in a beautiful lie. "Let's start the bidding at $20, Finch yelled. A bargain for a woman of her condition. "Do I hear 20? A hand went up. A ranch hand with cruel small eyes and a missing front tooth. 20. "I've got 20 from young Travis." A fine start. "Do I hear 25? "Look at her boys. Still got fire in her. You'll have to break her in." "But isn't that half the fun?" 25, shouted another man. This one, older, with a lecherous glint in his eye. The bidding climbed a ladder of degradation. 30, 35, 40. Each bid was a hammer blow nailing her coffin shut. Amelia's defiance began to crumble, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. She saw her future in the faces of the bidders, a life of drudgery, of fear of being an object for a man's use. She thought of the life growing inside her, a tiny, innocent flicker, and for the first time wished it had never been conceived. The thought was so monstrous it choked her. $50. Finch bellowed, his face flushed with excitement. Going once to Mr. Abernathy. A fine price for a fine piece. Going twice. It was then that the stranger appeared. He didn't ride into town. He simply materialized, as if he'd stepped out of the heat haze itself. He stood at the edge of the crowd, a tall, lean silhouette against the blinding sun. He wore dark, practical clothing, coated in the same red dust as everything else. But on him it looked less like grime and more like camouflage. A low-slung gun belt with a single well-worn Colt Peacemaker rested on his hip. His face was unreadable, shadowed by the brim of a battered hat, but the set of his jaw was hard as granite. The crowd, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, quieted. All eyes turned from Amelia to the newcomer. He moved with a liquid grace that was unnervingly silent, parting the sea of men, not by pushing, but by their own instinct to step aside. He walked directly to the front, stopping a few feet from the auction block. He ignored Finch completely. His gaze, a piercing cold grey, locked onto Amelia's. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. In his eyes, she saw none of the leering hunger of the other men. She saw nothing. An emptiness that was somehow more frightening. It was the calm at the center of a storm. Finch, annoyed at the interruption, puffed out his chest. "Well now, stranger, come to join the festivities. The bidding stands at $50. The stranger didn't look at him. His eyes remained on Amelia. A flicker of something recognition, pity crossed his features before being extinguished. I'm not a bidder, the stranger said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the silence. Finch's grin turned into a sneer. Then you're wasting my time and interfering with a legal transaction. This is the collection of a duly owed debt. Move along. The debt is Sinclair's, the stranger stated, not as a question, but as a fact. Beau Sinclair's, yes. Finch confirmed, growing wary. A gambling debt. He put up his collateral. He gestured dismissively at Amelia. I'm here to settle it, the stranger said. Finch laughed, a short, barking sound. With what? You look like you ain't got 2 cents to rub together. The price is $50, gold or silver coin only. The stranger slowly, deliberately raised his hands to his hat, took it off, and gently smacked the dust from it. He had dark, unruly hair, and a face that was all sharp angles and old scars. He looked like a man who had seen too much and said too little. He placed the hat back on his head. I don't pay with gold, he said, his voice dropping even lower, carrying a deadly promise. He took a single step forward. I pay with blood. Before Finch could process the words, the stranger's hand blurred. It wasn't the fastest draw anyone had ever seen, but it was the most certain. The Colt seemed to leap into his palm as if it were a living thing. He didn't fire at Finch. Instead, in 2 deafening reports that echoed off the false front buildings, he shot the rope that bound Amelia's hands. The frayed ends snapped apart, freeing her. Chaos erupted. The crowd surged backward, a panicked wave of bodies scrambling for cover. Travis, the first bidder, made a foolish, drunken move for his own pistol. The stranger's Colt barked a 3rd time. Travis screamed and clutched his hand, his pistol clattering into the dust. Amelia stumbled back, her freed hands going instinctively to her belly. She stared wide-eyed at the man who stood between her and the mob. Finch stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, his chins wobbling. You're insane. You just assaulted a man. You can't. The debt. The stranger interrupted his voice like chipping ice. He leveled the barrel of the Colt directly at Finch's sweating forehead. Is it paid? Finch's eyes darted from the unwavering barrel of the gun to the cold, merciless eyes behind it. All the bluster drained out of him, leaving a quivering mass of fear. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Yes, he squeaked, his voice a pathetic whisper. Paid. Paid in full. She leaves with me, the stranger said. It wasn't a request. Finch could only nod, his jowls trembling. The stranger kept the gun on him, but his eyes flicked to Amelia. Ma'am. He gave a short, sharp nod toward the alley beside the saloon. The message was clear: move. Numbly putting one foot in front of the other, Amelia scrambled off the whiskey crates. She didn't look back at the terrified saloon owner or the stunned crowd. She kept her eyes on the back of the stranger, the man who had just bought her freedom with 3 bullets. As she followed him into the shadows of the alley, she had no idea if she had been rescued or merely transferred to a more dangerous owner. The stranger, whose name she still didn't know, led her through a labyrinth of back alleys, his long strides forcing her into a near run. He moved with a predator's certainty, his head constantly scanning rooftops and doorways. The sounds of shouting from the main street faded, replaced by the skittering of rats and the mournful creak of a wind-battered sign. He stopped at the back of the livery stable, where a single lean horse stood waiting, already saddled. It was a tough-looking Mustang, all muscle and grit, much like its owner. Without a word, he checked the cinch, his movements economical and precise. Amelia finally found her voice, though it came out as a ragged whisper. Who? Who are you? He paused, his back to her. Name's Nathaniel Corrigan. Folks call me Nate. He didn't turn around. His focus was on the horse on escape. Why did you do that? She pressed, wrapping her arms around herself. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving a bone-deep tremor in its wake. You don't know me. Nate finally turned his grey eyes, assessing her. I know Barty Finch, and I know the Sinclair name. That's enough. He gestured to the horse. Get on. The command was blunt, but not unkind. It was the detached instruction of a man focused on survival. Amelia hesitated, looking at the high saddle. In her condition, mounting was a challenge. Seeing her hesitation, Nate let out a sigh that was barely audible. He stepped forward, laced his fingers together to offer her a step, and easily boosted her up onto the saddle. She settled awkwardly, sitting astride, like a man, her dress bunching up around her legs. He swung up behind her, with effortless grace, his body a solid, warm presence at her back. His arm came around her, but not in an embrace. His hand rested firmly on the saddle horn, boxing her in keeping her secure. Hold on, he ordered, and with a soft click of his tongue, urged the horse into a brisk trot. Then a canter, leaving Redemption Gulch and its fresh nightmare behind in a cloud of red dust. They rode for hours, saying nothing. The sun beat down, and the rhythmic sway of the horse was a lulling, hypnotic motion. Amelia found herself leaning back slightly against Nate's chest, drawing a strange comfort from his silent strength. He was a violent man, a killer perhaps, but his violence had been her salvation. It was a terrifying paradox. As dusk began to paint the sky, in shades of bruised purple and orange, they left the open plains and entered a region of rocky mesas and sparse, hardy pines. Nate guided the horse up a winding, barely there trail that led to a small, hidden cabin tucked against a rock face, almost invisible from below. It was little more than a one-room shack, but the chimney trickled a thin wisp of smoke, promising shelter. An old man emerged as they approached a shotgun held loosely in his wrinkled hands. He was weathered and bent with a shock of white hair and a face like a dried apple. Nate. By God, I didn't expect you back so soon. The old man rasped, his eyes widening as he saw Amelia. He lowered the shotgun. Things got complicated, Gus, Nate said, swinging down from the horse. He then reached up to help Amelia, his hands strong and steady on her waist as he lowered her to the ground. Her legs were shaky, and she leaned against the horse for a moment to steady herself. I can see that Gus said, his gaze softening as he took in her disheveled state and obvious pregnancy. Poor child. Get her inside. There's stew on the stove. The cabin was sparse but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with a small cot on either side. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. It was a hermit's home, a place to hide from the world. Gus, whose full name was Augustus Poe, was an old prospector who had long since given up on finding gold and settled for finding peace. He was, Amelia gathered, one of Nate's few friends. Gus bustled about, fetching a bowl of hearty venison stew and a cup of water for Amelia. She ate ravenously, the first real food she'd had in days. Nate, meanwhile, unsaddled his horse and rubbed it down with practiced care, his movements speaking of a deep, quiet bond with the animal. When he finally came inside, he took the other bowl of stew and sat at the table, his posture still radiating a coiled tension. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire. It was Amelia who broke it. You said you knew the Sinclair name. Nate looked up from his stew, his eyes hooded. I do. And that's why you helped me." He didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked a question of his own. "What did Beau Sinclair promise you?" The question was a key, unlocking the dam of her pain and humiliation. The story spilled out of her: the courtship in Philadelphia, the sweet letters, the promises of a future, the journey west, the cold rejection, the final crushing abandonment. She told it all, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, anger beginning to burn away the shame. Gus listened with a pained expression, occasionally shaking his head and muttering, "Damn that Alistair Sinclair. Damn his whole bloodline." When she finished, her cheeks were wet with tears she hadn't realized she'd shed. Nate had listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames of the fire. "Beau is a coward," Nate said, his voice flat. "But the poison comes from the root. Alistair Sinclair, his father. He owns the valley, the politicians, the law. He believes his family is royalty, and the rest of us are just dirt under his boots." "You know him?" Amelia asked. A shadow passed over Nate's face, so dark and profound it seemed to chill the room. "I used to work for a man named Patrick O'Malley. He had a small ranch, good water, healthy stock. It bordered Sinclair's land. Sinclair wanted his water. He tried to buy it. O'Malley wouldn't sell. He'd built that place with his own hands." Nate paused, his knuckles white, where he gripped his empty bowl. Sinclair's men started cutting fences, spooking his herd. Then one night, the barn was set on fire. O'Malley, his wife. They didn't make it out. The sheriff, bought and paid for by Sinclair, called it a tragic accident. A stray lantern. And you, Amelia, whispered, her heart aching for this story, for this man. I was 17. They'd sent me to town for supplies. When I got back, there was nothing left but smoke and ghosts. I saw Alistair Sinclair the next day. He rode past, looked at the ashes and smiled. That's when I learned what a Sinclair's promise is worth. The silence that followed was heavy with shared grief, a bond forged in the crucible of a common enemy. Amelia now understood. Nate hadn't just saved a woman. He had struck a blow, however small, against the man who had destroyed his world. Her plight was a reflection of his own past. "Finch won't let this go," Nate said, his voice pulling them back to the present danger. He was humiliated. He'll send men. Not lawmen, but thugs. Bounty hunters. We can't stay here long. It's not safe for Gus. Where will we go? The question was full of a terrifying uncertainty. She had no one, nothing. She was entirely dependent on this scarred, silent man. "There's a place," Nate said, standing and walking to the small, grimy window to peer out into the darkness. North, through the Badlands, a small town called Haven. The law there is run by a man who can't be bought. But it's a hard journey, especially for—" He trailed off, glancing at her. A woman in my condition, she finished for him, a spark of her old fire returning. "I am stronger than I look, Mr. Corrigan." For the first time, the corner of his mouth twitched the ghost of a smile. "I'm counting on it, Miss Thornton. Get some rest. We leave at first light." As Amelia lay on the cot, the rough blanket pulled up to her chin, she listened to the sounds of the two men murmuring by the fire. She heard Nate give Gus a small pouch of coins, telling him to lay low for a few weeks. She heard Gus warn Nate that Alistair Sinclair had a long reach and an even longer memory. Sleep did not come easily. Her mind replayed the auction, the jeering faces, the crack of Nate's gun. But for the first time in months, the terror was mixed with something else, a fragile, flickering ember of hope. She was no longer just a victim. She was allied with a man who understood her enemy, a man who had his own ghosts to appease. Their path was dangerous, their future unknown, but they were moving, and for now that was enough. She drifted off to sleep, her hand resting on her belly, a silent promise to the life within, that she would fight for them both. True to his word, they left as the first hint of grey dawn touched the eastern sky. Gus pressed a bundle of dried jerky and a water skin into Amelia's hands, his eyes full of worry. "You watch out for him. You hear?" he whispered to her, nodding toward Nate. "He carries more burdens than any one man should." The journey was brutal. The Badlands were a raw, elemental world of sun-scorched rock and thorny scrub. The landscape was a maze of canyons and arroyos, a place where a man could easily get lost and die of thirst. But Nate navigated it with an uncanny instinct, as if he could read the terrain like a map. He pushed them hard, keeping to the low ground, always mindful of their back trail. For 2 days they spoke little. The hardship of the trail became their only language. Nate was a tireless guardian. He found sheltered spots for them to rest during the blistering heat of midday, shared his water ration, when hers ran low, and who took every watch at night, sitting with his rifle across his lap while she slept fitfully. Amelia, in turn, refused to be a liability. She grit her teeth against the aches in her back and the weariness that settled deep in her bones. She learned to move with the rhythm of the horse, to conserve her energy to read the subtle signs of Nate's mood in the set of his shoulders or the tightness of his jaw. A silent respect grew between them. He respected her resilience. She respected his competence. On the third night, they made camp in a narrow canyon, a sliver of starry sky visible between the towering rock walls. The air was cold, and Nate built a small, smokeless fire in an overhang. As they chewed on the tough jerky, Amelia felt a sharp, sudden pain in her lower back, so intense it made her gasp. Nate was on his feet instantly, his hand hovering near his gun. "What is it?" "It's nothing," she said, trying to breathe through the cramping. "Just a spasm." But it wasn't just a spasm. Another wave of pain washed over her, and she couldn't stifle a low moan. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. It was too soon. Far too soon. Nate's face was grim in the firelight. The stoic mask had slipped, revealing a raw concern that startled her. "We're still 2 days from Haven. The horse can't go any faster." "I'll be fine," she insisted, though her voice trembled. She was a liability after all. The thought was unbearable. He ignored her protestations, his mind clearly working. He scanned the canyon walls, his gaze lingering on a series of ancient faded paintings, high up on the rock face handprints and stick-figure animals left by a people long vanished. "Stay here," he commanded, and before she could argue, he began to climb. He moved up the rock face with the same unnerving grace she'd seen in the alley, finding handholds and footholds that seemed invisible to her. He was making for a dark cleft in the rock, about 50 feet up. He disappeared inside for a few moments, then re-emerged and skillfully made his way back down. "There's a cave," he announced. "It's dry and sheltered, and there's a spring seeping through the back. The old ones knew where to live." He looked at her, his expression serious. "We're not moving until you're better. Finch's men are a problem, but this is a bigger one." The thought of being a burden was mortifying, but the pain was real and terrifying. She allowed him to help her, his arm a steady support, as they made the slow, arduous trek up to the cave. The cave was more of a large hollow, but as he'd said, it was deep, dry, and protected from the wind. A small pool of crystal-clear water collected at the back, a miracle in this arid land. Nate laid out her bedroll and his own, making a thicker pallet for her to lie on. The cramping continued for hours. Amelia lay curled on her side, her hands pressed to her belly, whispering pleas to her unborn child. "Not yet, little one. Please, not yet. We're not safe yet." Nate did what he could. He brought her water, soaked a spare cloth to cool her forehead, and sat by the entrance a silent, watchful sentinel. He didn't offer empty platitudes or reassurances. He simply offered his presence, and in the desolate loneliness of the Badlands, that was a profound comfort. Sometime before dawn, the pain began to subside, the spasms easing into a dull ache. Exhausted but relieved, Amelia finally drifted into a deep sleep. When she woke, the sun was high in the sky. She felt weak, but the sharp pains were gone. Nate was sitting by the cave entrance, sharpening his knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic a strangely calming sound. He had snared 2 rabbits which were already skinned and ready for the fire. "You feel better?" he asked, not looking up from his task. "Yes." "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "You didn't have to stay." He paused, his hands stilling. "Yes," he said, finally, meeting her gaze. "I did." The simple 2-word declaration hung in the air between them. It was more than an admission of responsibility. It was a statement of choice. He had tied his fate to hers, not just out of a shared enmity for the Sinclairs, but for a reason he himself might not yet understand. They stayed in the cave for another day and a night, allowing her to regain her strength. The enforced stillness changed the dynamic between them. The silence was no longer just the absence of words. It was comfortable, companionable. She watched him work, impressed by his self-sufficiency, by the way he belonged to this harsh landscape. He in turn would watch her as she sat by the pool staring at her reflection, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. That evening, as they cooked the rabbit over a small fire, she found the courage to ask the question that had been hovering at the edge of her thoughts. "Your friend Gus," she began. "He said to damn the whole Sinclair bloodline. He meant more than just Alistair and Beau, didn't he?" Nate prodded the fire with a stick. "The Sinclairs have been poisoning this part of the country for 20 years. Alistair has a brother, a man named Sterling Sinclair. He's a different kind of snake. Not a cattle baron, but a money man. He runs a bank in Helena, forecloses on ranchers who can't make their payments often because Alistair's men have made sure they can't. They work together, one breaking the body, the other breaking the spirit." He looked up, his eyes hard as flint. "And they have a sister, Genevieve. She married a federal judge, Lawrence Reed, a man who ensures any legal troubles the Sinclairs encounter simply disappear. They're not just a family. They're an empire built on bone and heartbreak." The scope of it was staggering. Amelia had thought her problem was a cowardly fiancé and a greedy saloon owner. She now saw she had stumbled into a war, a generational conflict she was completely unequipped to fight. "How can you stand against all that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You're just one man. I'm not trying to tear down an empire," Nate said, his voice low and intense. "I'm just looking for one man. Alistair. I want him to look me in the eye and admit what he did to the O'Malleys. That's the debt I'm here to collect. His quest was so personal, so focused. It wasn't about grand justice. It was about a specific gaping wound in his past that had never healed. She saw then that his scars weren't just on his face. He was a man hollowed out by grief, and vengeance was the only thing he'd used to fill the void. "What happens after?" she asked softly. He looked at her, and for a moment he seemed lost. The question seemed to hang in the air, one he had never dared to ask himself. After he repeated, as if the word were a foreign concept, "I don't know. I've never thought that far." In that moment of stark honesty, Amelia's heart went out to him completely. He had saved her life, but he had no plan for his own. She who had lost everything suddenly felt a fierce protective urge for this broken man. "Well," she said, her voice gaining a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "Maybe it's time you did. You can't live in the past forever, Nate. Sooner or later you have to build a future." He stared at her, a strange light dawning in his grey eyes. He saw not a helpless victim, but a woman of incredible fortitude, a woman who, despite having every reason to despair, was talking about the future. Their journey had started as an escape. Now, sitting in that ancient cave, surrounded by the echoes of a lost people, it felt like the beginning of something else entirely. They were two broken souls adrift in a hostile world, but for the first time, they weren't entirely alone. They reached the outskirts of Haven 2 days later. It was nothing like the raw, opportunistic squalor of Redemption Gulch. Haven was a small, orderly town, nestled in a green, watered valley, a pocket of civilization carved out of the wilderness. The streets were wide, the buildings had fresh coats of paint, and there was a church with a real steeple. More importantly, there was an air of peace, a distinct lack of men wearing their guns with the casual menace Amelia had grown used to. Nate led them not to the hotel, but to a small, neat house on the edge of town, where a doctor's shingle hung by the front door, Dr. Elias Vance. An older man with kind, intelligent eyes and a neatly trimmed grey beard answered their knock. His gaze took in the entire situation in a single, practiced sweep. Nate's wary posture, Amelia's exhaustion, the dust of a long trail on them both. Nathaniel the doctor said, a tone of relieved surprise in his voice. "I'd heard you were stirring up hornets over in the Western Territories. It seems the rumors were true." He stepped aside. "Bring the lady in. She looks like she could use a soft bed more than a hard saddle." Dr. Vance's wife, a warm, matronly woman named Martha, immediately took charge of Amelia. She clucked with sympathy upon hearing a heavily edited version of their story, that Amelia was a widow whose husband's family had cast her out and led her to a quiet, sunlit guest room. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Amelia sank into a real mattress under a clean-smelling quilt and let the bone-deep exhaustion claim her. While she rested, Nate spoke with the doctor in his study, the room smelling of antiseptic and old books. "Alistair Sinclair's doing, I presume?" Elias Vance asked, pouring 2 small glasses of brandy. Nate nodded, taking the glass. "His son Beau is the one who abandoned her, but the rot starts at the top. Finch in Redemption. Gulch tried to auction her off to pay the boy's gambling debts." Elias sighed, shaking his head. "The Sinclair shadow grows longer every year. I fear for what this country is becoming, Nathaniel. Men like him, with their greed and their power, they choke the life out of everything. What is your plan?" "Let her rest. Get her strength back. Then I'm going after Alistair." The doctor looked at him over the rim of his glasses. "You mean you're going to get yourself killed? You know the Sinclair Ranch is a fortress. He has 24 men on his payroll, all of them hard cases. You can't ride in there alone." "I'm not asking for help," Nate said, his voice hard. "I know you're not," Elias said patiently. "You never do. But this is different. You're not just a lone man seeking vengeance anymore. You have her to think about. And the child." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "What happens to them if Alistair's men put a bullet in you?" The question struck Nate with the force of a physical blow. He had been so consumed by his own mission, his own pain, that he'd seen Amelia as a part of it, a responsibility within it. He hadn't truly considered the aftermath, the world after his confrontation, the future she had spoken of in the cave. If he died, he would be leaving her in the exact same position he'd found her in, alone, vulnerable and hunted. He said nothing, swirling the brandy in his glass, the turmoil evident on his face. "There are other ways to fight men like Sinclair." Elias continued softly. "His power comes from his reputation, his aura of invincibility. People are afraid of him. If that fear could be chipped away, if his crimes were brought into the light, he's just a man. A rich, cruel man, but a man nonetheless." "The law is his," Nate countered bitterly. "His brother-in-law is Judge Reed. Federal law, yes. But local sentiment is a powerful thing. Reputations can be ruined. Fortunes can be lost." The doctor's words were seeds planting an idea that was alien to Nate's direct, violent methods. It was a strategy of patience and cunning, not of bullets. Over the next week, Haven was true to its name. Amelia slowly recovered her strength under Martha Vance's gentle care. She ate proper meals, slept in a safe bed, and for the first time allowed herself to think about the baby, with hope instead of fear. She and Martha would sit on the porch in the afternoons, mending clothes, and the simple domesticity of it was a balm to her wounded spirit. She saw little of Nate. He was restless, a caged wolf. He spent his days at the edge of town practicing with his Colt, the rapid series of gunshots, a constant reminder of the violence that still clung to him. But she also saw him in quiet moments, watching her from a distance with an unreadable expression, or listening as Dr. Vance spoke of politics, law, and the interconnected web of power in the territory. Something was changing in him. The hard certainty of his vengeance was being tempered by something else, doubt, or perhaps a dawning sense of a future beyond it. One evening, a rider came into town, a Pony Express agent with news from the east. He brought word that threw their fragile peace into chaos. A notice had been posted by the Sinclair Cattle Company, distributed in every town and settlement for 500 miles. It offered a reward of $500 a fortune for the capture of a fugitive named Nathaniel Corrigan, wanted for assault and horse theft in Redemption Gulch. It went on to describe his accomplice, a pregnant woman named Amelia Thornton, branding her a thief and a woman of low morals who had fled with him. The notice was a masterstroke of cruelty. Alistair Sinclair hadn't just made them outlaws, he had poisoned the well of public opinion against them. He'd turned Amelia's name to mud, ensuring no decent person would help her. Dr. Vance read the notice with a grim face. "He's boxing you in, making it so there's nowhere for you to run." Nate's hands clenched into fists. His first instinct, the one he had honed for years, screamed at him to ride out, to end it, to meet the violence with more violence. It was a suicide mission, and he knew it. But the thought of Amelia being branded a common criminal of her name, being dragged through the dirt, ignited a protective fury in him that was far more potent than his old need for revenge. He looked at Amelia. She stood by the window, her face pale, but her expression resolute. She wasn't crying. She had met this new blow with the same quiet strength she'd shown all along. "He won't win," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "We can't let him." In that moment, Nate's path became clear. Dr. Vance was right. Riding into the Sinclair ranch to die was not a solution. It was an abdication of his real responsibility. His old quest for vengeance had been a solitary, selfish thing. Protecting Amelia, protecting her future and the future of her child, was something more. It required him to be more than just a gunslinger. It required him to be smarter, to be better. "No," Nate said, his voice calm and clear. The storm inside him finally settled. "He won't." He turned to Dr. Vance. "You said there were other ways to fight him. Tell me more." The decision was made. They were no longer running. They were going to turn and face the shadow, not with guns blazing, but with a truth that was sharper and more deadly than any bullet. Their new target was not just Alistair Sinclair's life, but the very foundation of his power. His name. The plan they devised was audacious, relying on Whisper's timing and the fundamental weaknesses of arrogant men. Their weapon would not be Nate's Colt, but a simple, undeniable story. Amelia's. Dr. Vance, it turned out, was more than just a physician. He was a man with a wide network of correspondence, a quiet node in a web of decent folk who had grown weary of the Sinclairs' tyranny. Their target was not the ranch, but the town of Helena, the seat of Sterling Sinclair's financial power, and the home of Judge Lawrence Reed. It was 100 miles away, and Alistair Sinclair would be there. A major cattleman's auction was scheduled, an event Alistair never missed. It was a chance for him to parade his success to hold court among his peers. He would be at his most confident, his most exposed. The journey was tense. They traveled not as fugitives, but as a respectable couple taking the main roads. Nate had shaved, and Dr. Vance had provided him with a decent suit. Amelia wore a simple but elegant dress provided by Martha, her pregnancy now gracefully apparent, not something to be hidden in shame. They were Mr. and Mrs. Cole, a couple traveling to meet family. The lie was their shield. Dr. Vance had gone ahead of them, using his connections to sow the first seeds of the story. He didn't speak of auctions or kidnappings. He spoke of tragedy, of a heartbroken young woman from a good family back east, cruelly abandoned by the heir to a great fortune. He painted a picture of Beau Sinclair's caddish behavior, a story that was all too believable. The whispers started quiet and insidious, spreading through the drawing rooms and back offices of Helena. When Nate and Amelia arrived, the city was already humming with the rumor. They checked into the finest hotel, the one where Alistair Sinclair always kept a suite. It was a bold, dangerous move, placing them directly in the lion's den. The confrontation came sooner than they expected. As they crossed the grand gilded lobby, they came face to face with Beau Sinclair. He was exquisitely dressed, a flower in his lapel, but his face went slack with shock, all color draining from it. His eyes darted from Amelia's serene face and swollen belly to the tall, imposing man at her side. "Amelia," he stammered. What are you doing here?" Nate stepped slightly in front of her, a silent, protective barrier. Amelia, however, placed a hand on his arm and stepped forward. She would face this ghost herself. "I believe you know why I'm here, Beaufort," she said, her voice perfectly level, carrying across the suddenly quiet lobby. "You left some matters unresolved." Beau flinched as if struck. He looked around, seeing the curious, judgmental eyes of the city's elite upon him. This was not some dusty backwater town. This was his world, and she had brought her shame directly to his doorstep. "This is not the place," he hissed, grabbing her arm. Nate's hand shot out and clamped around Beau's wrist like a manacle. "Take your hand off her," Nate said, his voice dangerously low. Beau tried to pull away, but Nate's grip was unbreakable. Fear, pure and primal, flashed in Beau's eyes. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm the man who settled your debt in Redemption Gulch." Nate said, his words like chips of ice. At that moment, a booming voice cut through the tension. "What is the meaning of this?" Alistair Sinclair strode toward them. He was a bull of a man, with a thick neck, a florid face, and eyes like cold blue stones. He radiated an aura of absolute power. He saw his son, his former paramour, and the stranger, and his face hardened into a mask of thunderous fury. "Father, Beau began wilting under his father's glare. Silence. Alistair snapped. He turned his full, terrifying attention on Amelia. "You shameless harlot. You dare to show your face here with this gutter trash?" He gestured dismissively at Nate. "I have a $500 bounty on your heads. Then you should pay it," Nate said, releasing Beau's wrist with a shove. "We're right here." Alistair was taken aback by the man's audacity. "You think you can challenge me? In my own city?" "This isn't about a challenge," Amelia said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. She refused to be cowed. "It's about the truth. A truth your son was too cowardly to tell you, and you were too arrogant to see." She looked directly into Alistair's eyes. "I am carrying your grandchild, a Sinclair, and you allowed your name to be used to have me sold like cattle." A hush had fallen over the entire lobby. This was no longer a private dispute. It was a public spectacle. The whispers Dr. Vance had started had just found their thunderous voice. "Listen." Alistair roared, his face turning a shade of purple. "She is a fortune-hunting whore who consorted with a wanted criminal." "Am I a new voice?" asked. Dr. Elias Vance stepped out of the crowd, his presence calm and authoritative. "I am Dr. Vance. I have tended to Miss Thornton. I can attest to her character. But perhaps we should hear from another witness." He gestured toward the hotel entrance. A man stood there, looking nervous but determined. It was Mr. Abernathy, the man who had placed the final bid at Amelia's auction. He had been tracked down by one of Dr. Tour, Vance's contacts, his conscience, and a small payment persuading him to travel to Helena. "Is it true?" "Mr. Sinclair," Dr. Vance asked, his voice projecting through the lobby, "that your son's debt to Barty Finch was settled by the public auction of this pregnant woman, an auction you implicitly sanctioned by putting a bounty on her head instead of helping her." Alistair was trapped. His power came from fear and reputation. Here, in front of his peers, his bankers, and his rivals, his reputation was being shredded. He saw the looks on their faces, not fear, but disgust and fascination. He had been outmaneuvered. His eyes narrowed, locking on Nate. He recognized the source of his defeat. This was not about the woman. This was about something else, something older. "I know you," he said slowly, the pieces clicking into place. "The O'Malley Ranch. The stable boy who disappeared." "I didn't disappear." Nate said, his voice hard with the weight of 2 decades of grief. You just stopped looking. You burned a family alive for a creek, Alistair. I was there. The accusation, raw and shocking, landed like a physical blow. The story of the O'Malley fire had been a local tragedy, officially an accident. But many had harbored private doubts. Hearing it spoken aloud with such certainty changed everything. Alistair Sinclair, the Titan, the Kingmaker, was finally, truly exposed. Not by a bullet, but by the combined weight of his sins brought into the light by the people he had wronged. His son was a coward. His name was tied to human trafficking, and an old, dark rumor of murder now had a living witness. He did the only thing a cornered beast could do. He lunged, not at Nate, but at Amelia, the source of his public humiliation. You, he bellowed, his face contorted with rage. Nate moved like lightning, shoving Amelia behind him and meeting Alistair's charge. He didn't draw his gun. He simply stood his ground, a rock against which the wave of Sinclair's fury crashed. He caught the older man's arms, and for a long moment the 2 men stood locked in a struggle of pure will, the boy whose life was destroyed and the man who had destroyed it. It's over, Alistair, Nate said, his voice strained with effort. It's all over. The fight went out of Alistair Sinclair. He sagged, a great balloon of a man, suddenly deflated. The lobby was silent, the judgment of 100 pairs of eyes raining down on him. His empire, built on fear, had crumbled under the weight of the truth. Judge Reed would not be able to make this disappear. Sterling Sinclair's bank would feel the tremors. Beau stood weeping, a pathetic, broken figure. The reckoning had come. And it wasn't a gunfight at high noon. It was a quiet, complete annihilation in a gilded hotel lobby. In the aftermath, the Sinclair empire fractured. The official investigation into the O'Malley fire was reopened with Nate's testimony as the centerpiece. Mr. Abernathy's account of the auction in Redemption Gulch, corroborated by others who were emboldened to speak, led to a federal warrant for Barty Finch. Beau Sinclair, facing public disgrace and disowned by what was left of his family's allies, vanished, rumored to have fled to Mexico. Alistair Sinclair, broken and facing murder charges, took his own life in his hotel suite before he could be arrested. The debt, in the end, was paid in full. Nate and Amelia did not stay in Helena to watch the ruins smolder. They had no taste for it. Their justice had been won, and their shared past was finally laid to rest. They returned to Haven, to the quiet sanity of the Vances' home. A month later, Amelia gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Liam. He had her blue eyes and a stubborn tuft of dark hair that reminded her with a pang of gentle irony of Nate's. Nate was there through it all. He was no longer the coiled, restless stranger. The emptiness in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet watchfulness, a deep and abiding tenderness that was reserved for Amelia and her son. The ghosts of his past had been appeased not by the act of revenge, but by the act of building something new. One clear, cool afternoon, as Amelia sat on the porch rocking, Liam Nate came and stood beside her. He had been quiet for days, and she knew a decision was weighing on him. "The O'Malley case is closed," he said. "They're calling me a hero." He said the word as if it tasted strange. "There's nothing keeping me here." Amelia's heart clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "Where will you go?" He looked out at the open horizon, the vast, promising expanse of land that stretched to the west. "I don't know. I never thought I'd have to choose." He turned to her, and the question that had been unspoken between them for months was finally in his eyes. "The thing is," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I find I don't want to choose alone anymore." He hesitated, a man far more comfortable with a gun than with the words of his heart. "Amelia, I know I'm not. I'm not the kind of man you ever imagined. I'm scarred and I've got a past. But your future, the one you spoke of in the cave, I'd like to be a part of building it. If you'll have me." Amelia looked up at him, at this man who had walked out of the dust and into her life, this stranger who had paid for her freedom with violence and then saved her soul with his quiet constancy. She looked down at the sleeping child in her arms, a symbol not of a mistake, but of a new beginning. Her life was not the one she had planned, but it was real, and it was hers. "Nate," she said, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across her face. "I think our future has already begun." She held out her free hand to him. He took it, his calloused fingers lacing with hers. It wasn't a promise of an easy life, but of a shared one. Together they looked out at the horizon, not as two broken people running from a dark past, but as a family ready to face the dawn. From the dust of an auction block to the promise of a new dawn, the story of Amelia and Nate is a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of lands, courage can bloom. It shows us that true justice isn't always found at the end of a gun barrel, but in the power of truth, and that the deepest scars can be healed by the most unexpected love. They weren't saints or legends. They were survivors who found in each other the strength to rebuild their world. If their story of survival justice and the birth of an unlikely family moved you, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button to let us know you want more tales from the Old West. Share this video with someone who appreciates a powerful drama, and most importantly, subscribe and ring that notification bell. Your support allows us to keep these stories alive. Thank you for listening.